Korean culture is really good for a developing country, but maybe not so good for a developed country. In making these videos and just being interested in Korea in general, I often ask the Korean people I know questions about Korea. And one of my favorite questions to ask is, when did Korea become a developed country? Now, the answers will vary because it's not an exact science of exactly, there's no clear definition of a developed country. So people will say, maybe it's 1988 when they had the Olympics. Maybe it was after the financial crisis in the late 90s. Some Korean people say it's not a developed country yet. It's still not a developed country. And this is confusing because it's hard to say if this is like Korean hyper-humbleism or if this is how they truthfully think. I mean, this is a problem I often have when I ask my Korean friends something. Are they just being hyper-humble? Or do they really think that? Because of this, it's really hard to pin down when most Korean people think that Korea became a developed country. I would say after the financial crisis, but that's just my opinion. But if there's one thing we're generally certain about, is that Korea is at least now a developed country. It's the 13th richest country in the world. And the way I got there was that a lot of Korean culture is very good for a country that's developing. The number one thing I could say about Korean culture is that its main point is working hard. Work a lot. If you're not working a lot, you're a bad person. If you're working a lot, you're a great person. People tend to work a lot. And when you're a developing country, you have this competitive advantage in labor. You're competing with developed countries where people are already rich and you have to pay workers a lot. And you're in a developing country where things are still cheap and that includes labor and you can pay people very little. Japan did this to America in the 60s, I guess, maybe the 70s, whereas I believe their first product they really won with was radios. So America, you had these expensive engineers designing the radios, you had these expensive factory workers making the radios, and Japan just said, hey, look, we could pay people half as much and we'll be able to have lower prices and we'll make a bunch of money. So when you're a developing country, all you need to do is produce as many radios as possible. Just throw out as much labor as possible. And Japan did that to America back in the day, and Korea did that to Japan not too long ago. And then China's doing it to everyone right now, and Vietnam's probably going to do it to China. And that's just the way that the world economics works. The problem is, once these developing countries become developed, how do they stay relevant? They can no longer just use absolute brute force of amount of labor. And they have to be, in my opinion, efficient. That's how you can stay competitive with these developing countries that have much cheaper labor. And there's a lot of efficiencies about being a developed country. Like you have access to better financial institutions. You have access to a lot of capital. Your country probably has good trade agreements with other rich countries. There's a lot of advantages. But also you can see how America has become as a very efficient sector, which is the tech sector. Okay, we pivoted to technology a lot because it's really efficient. You can see how an hour of coding at Google or Facebook or Apple, an hour of programming produces a huge amount of profit. Okay, the definition of efficiency, as far as it comes to economics, is how much profit do you make per hour of labor? How much profit do you make per minute or per second or per infinitesimally small moment of labor? And I try to look up the statistics about it, and there's varying ideas, but basically the top 20 countries are America or European countries. America's something like 5, Luxembourg's 1 because it's kind of this weird outlier, it's so small. And Korea generally is 30. Okay, the other countries that are as inefficient as Korea in the list are generally countries that are kind of poorer and don't have access to those advantages of a developed country, like financial institutions and large amounts of capital and stuff like that. But Korea has those developed countries' advantages, yet they're still at 30th. And the question is, why? And I think that the answer is that, well, the Korean ideal of working super hard is really good when you're a developing country. It's not necessarily the best route when you're a developed country. When you're a developed country, you really need to become efficient. And the thing about Korean culture is that working hard is really a good idea, but oftentimes working hard counterintuitively is bad for efficiency. Working more is bad for efficiency. Let me give you a quick example. Let's say I'm a business and I need roughly 60 hours of labor a day. I'm the company, I'm the business owner, whatever. I need to buy 60 hours of labor. Now I can hire 5 people who work 12 hours a day and I'll get my 60 hours of labor. Good. I can hire 6 people and they'll work 10 hours a day, and that will get me 60 hours of labor. Good. I can hire 8 people, and they'll work 7.5 hours a day, and that will get me 60 hours labor. Great. All 3 situations get me the amount of labor I need. But which situation is going to get me the most in return? Which situation is going to get me the most productivity? And I think it's pretty obvious when you look at it. It's probably the third group. Those guys, those 8 guys who are working 7.5 hours, they're probably going to be the most productive because it's really easy to understand. Anyone who's worked in an office or works a job in general, anywhere, when you first come in, you're maybe still tired, you haven't had your coffee, you're still getting things together, you're a little slow, but after maybe an hour, you're kind of at the top of your game. You remember you picked up where you left off the day before, everything's working well, and for a few hours, maybe 5 or 6 hours, you're really working as well as you can. And then maybe the 7th or 8th hour, it starts dropping off. You start thinking about the things you have to do when you get home, you start thinking about family problems, you start going on Facebook and checking social media more than you did, and you're just not going to be as productive, okay? And then by the time you get to the 10th or 11th hour, you're really unproductive. You're just sitting there waiting for the clock to tick over so you can go home or whatever it is. Now, maybe there are some workers, I don't know who get super productive by the end, and at their 12th hour, they're the most productive they've been all day. But in general, I think my idea of the fact that the more you go on after 7 or 8 hours, the less productive you get per hour. So that first group, they're spending 4 out of 12 hours of their day in this very unproductive zone. The second group is spending maybe 2 hours of their day in that unproductive zone where they're producing less per each hour. And that third group is being very productive. They don't hit that low point where because they're only working 7.5 hours, they don't hit that point where they start becoming less productive. This is not like new knowledge. This is common to everyone. So me, the company, the business owner or whatever, it's way better for me to just have people work 7.5 hours a day. I'm paying the same amount, but I'm getting more out of each hour. That's the definition of efficiency. So why doesn't this happen in Korea? I mean, maybe it's bad for the workers. Maybe the workers want to work 12 hours a day so they can earn more money. But another interesting question I try to ask a lot of Korean friends, especially people who are working or just starting working or whatever, I say, if you could work 20% less and get 20% less income, would you do it? And just in my experience, 80 or 90% of my friends will say, of course. Korean people recognize that their most valuable asset that they're not getting enough of is time. It's not money as much. Although Korean people want to earn money and save for their future and do all that good stuff, they realize that nobody has enough time to do anything, so time is very valuable. So in general, I think it's good for the employer to have people work shorter hours, and it's good for the workers to work shorter hours. So why isn't it happening? And like I said, if you want to compete as a developed country in the world now, you need efficiency. And this situation, working less per person, drives efficiency. So why isn't it happening? And I think the reason is another thing that comes out of Korean culture, which is this desire to quantify things, even things that are generally unquantifiable, but to quantify things and measure them. Now, this works in certain ways very well. Who's heavier? Stand on a scale. We know who's heavier. Who's taller? Here's a tape measure. See who's taller. But for things like efficiency, they're really hard to measure. And trust me, all humans want to quantify and measure things. It's just in Korea, there's, I think, a particular obsession with it. And as such, I think a lot of Korean people ignore the idea of efficiency because it's hard to know how much someone produces. Whereas it's very easy to know how much time someone puts in working. How long was that employee sitting in that chair? Was it 8 hours? Not so good. Was it 10 hours? Pretty good. Was it 12 hours? What a great employee. One of the common things I always hear about is, especially when it's a new employee at a company, they have to be there as long as the boss. And it's really weird because there's no focus on how much they're producing. Like I said, Korean culture tends to not want to confront things that are not easily quantifiable and measurable. So they just kind of ignore that. And then they focus on the thing which is quantifiable and measurable, which is how many hours you work a week. You can see that this also happens with English skill. It's really hard to quantify and measure how good someone is at English or any language. And in Korea, how good you are at English is often a point of whether or not you should be hired. It helps in a lot of ways. So even though you can't really quantify it, Korean people came up with a way to quantify it, which is these standardized tests like TOEIC, TOEFL, all this stuff. And any native speaker, even Korean people know it's not a great way to do it. But like I said, there's this heavy Korean desire to quantify and measure everything. So they do it with English, and they do it with workers. And they don't do it by efficiency or productivity of the worker. They do it by the thing that can be quantified, which is hours worked, which is not necessarily the best way to go. So I think Korean society and culture that presses that you should work more helped a lot with Korea become, when Korea was a developing country, and helped make Korea the developed country that it is now. But now that it is a developed country, these things about needing to quantify things and measure them, as well as this idea of just working more no matter what, is really not the best route a developed country should go if it wants to stay relevant in the world's economy today.